Greetings, everyone. My name is Brenda Ahlberg with the Kenai Peninsula Borough, and with me today are three experts in the field regarding both after the fire safety as well as mushroom identification and gathering or harvesting. So I'd like to welcome Miss Leah Eskelin with the Refuge, as well as Miss Kate Mohatt, who is also with U.S. Forest Service, joining us today with some very good information for those who are anxious to get in the field. Thank you and welcome, both of you. I'll tag off to Miss Leah for introductions, detailed introductions, as well as what we're doing tonight.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Brenda. We are really glad to have Kate with us tonight. I know that, the fire of 2019, Swan Lake Fire, was a lot for the Kenai Peninsula community to handle last year. Coming into 2020, the first thing that people kind of started asking about as we got into the spring season was what is going to go on with morel mushrooms. And what better way to answer those questions than to have this opportunity to speak to an expert in the field. Kate Mohatt works over at the Chugach National Forest, one of the two agencies that experienced Swan Lake Fire. I work for the Fish and Wildlife Service at Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. Swan Lake Fire was, again, in 2019, a very large fire. It burned for over 150 days, starting by lightning on June 5th, 2019. And because of that, there's a very large burn scar that remains afterwards. After wildland fire, you end up with the conditions kind of ripe for welcoming morel mushrooms. We've had really large fires on the Kenai Peninsula in the past that have been very productive with morels. And with a lot of us being at home right now and looking for ways to spend time with our families, I really have as one of our goals tonight to give a way to go out and enjoy the outdoors and be together, but also do so safely, because there's some new hazards that are out there in the woods. We're really familiar with this Kenai Peninsula of ours, but the landscape's changed a lot. So tonight we're going to talk about the fire. I'll just really briefly cover some hazards and some ways to kind of learn some more information while planning that trip out. And then Kate's going to give us the down and dirty, really good stuff that we're all here for, which is how to find burn morels and how to identify them and all that good stuff. So Kate, if you don't mind starting, we promise not to belabor the point with lots of graphics, but we're going to use a couple of things. Everyone learns a little differently. So bear with me, we'll get this started. And I'm just going to start through things. If you'll just advance to the next slide, please. So this is the Swan Lake Fire. Again, 167,182 acres on the Kenai Peninsula in south central Alaska. It burned back in the summer of 2019 and for over about 150 days with about 3,000 personnel. If you notice that the fire stayed within what we call the federal landscape. So most of it was on the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, which is the green part to the west or left side of the screen. And then the white portion is the Chugach National Forest. And towards the end of the summer in 2019, the fire progressed through some kind of valleys onto the forest. So we'll talk a lot in detail about what this landscape looks like, but this map is available through a variety of different online resources. We'll share that in the comments on this post, but if you just search Swan Lake Fire 2019, you will find links for the NC web page, which has a website. Also, kenai.fws.gov has access to mapping as well. So next slide, please. The burn area of any wildland fire has some standard hazards to expect. As trees in Alaska experience wildland fire, their root systems are very shallow. And so the moment that root system is affected, or the substrate, all that soil that they're growing in is burned, they have a tendency of falling over. We have ash pits, which is just where everything has burned underground. And then we have tripping hazards. I'm going to go into that a little bit more detail, but there's a lot of resources online that give you this. So you don't have to take lots of notes. Just listen, enjoy this presentation, and then we'll have opportunity at the end to ask questions, but there's a lot of written information too. Next slide. All right, so ash pits. This is kind of, doesn't exist on every wildland fire burn area, but for the Swan Lake Fire, because it burned for 5 months, it burned very deep into the forest layer. All that organic material burned a really long time. Many of our fires, especially here in South Central Alaska, tend to hold over for the entire winter. So you can be expectant of smoke. Those are typically interior smokes. They are not on the edge of the fire scar, but that can happen, which also means that there's still heat being held underground. Where all of the organic material has burned, you have a chance of stepping into ultimately a pocket of nothing. Hopefully not hot, but we've experienced burns in these old ash pits before. So the most important thing, don't you love how I said stay on a designated trail? I know you're not going to do that. Mushroom hunters are not going to stay on trails, but the concept is pay attention to where you're putting your feet. Carry a probe, carry a walking stick, put it ahead of you. Last weekend, I was out looking for morels in Swan Lake Fire burn area, and I stepped into about an 8-inch ash pit, and I was doing all of those things that I thought I was supposed to be doing right. It happens. It can be very, scary, and some of them are waist deep. So just be very alert. Make sure that you're all staying together if you've got young children, but also keep pets at home. This is probably not the time to let your dog run around because it's hazardous. Next slide, please. The other hazard that's out there, like I was telling you at the beginning, those trees are growing in a really shallow root base, and so they can fall over almost with no warning. Windy days are especially dangerous, so paying attention to weather forecasts and planning your trip out accordingly, and also paying attention. It's very tempting to just look down all the time on the hunt, on the search, but making sure that you're being aware of your surroundings while you're out enjoying the refuge or the forest is really important. So planning your trip and also making sure that someone knows that you have a plan to go out, so that if you are overdue and you don't come back when planned, that we know, not we, I won't be able to follow for you, but your trusted friend will know to check in with you. Next slide, please. The third hazard I'm going to talk about specifically tonight, and then we'll go into some general trip planning, is tripping hazards. This seems super obvious, but a lot of the trees that used to be growing 100 feet up in the air have fallen over, and they have different branches coming off of them. They are burned and charred, so they don't show up like a tree typically does. So there's two different things to pay attention to here. The obvious part of if you're stepping over something, you need to make sure you aren't tripping into some, into a hole or something, but also that you should pay attention to your eye protection. Wearing glasses or sunglasses is a really important thing because those branches just stick out and are at eye level in some cases. So paying attention to that is just something that you may not have put into your bag already, eye protection. The last thing, and it's okay, you can stay on this. The last thing that I wanted to mention here is closed-toed shoes are a must. It's warm, especially for Alaskans. It's hard to put socks and boots on again, but this is the time to wear a good, rugged, supportive pair of shoes or boots because it's dirty, but it also has a lot of just uneven soils to work with. So last thing that I really want to touch on, especially as we're planning our trip, is that the landscape is completely different than you remember. I was out, like I said, this last weekend, and even in the first 3 miles of Chugach Lake Road coming in from Jim's Landing, the Cooper Landing side, the first 3 miles does not look anything like you all have remembered it. It's beautiful. The vistas are amazing. But likewise, those views that you're expecting, if you've done any off-trail walking on refuge or forest, they don't look the same. So making sure you have a GPS or maybe a backup of a GPS and a phone or a map and compass, planning where you're going to go, making sure that all of your people in your party know where you're headed. That's really important. I'm more than happy to help with some basic access of information for where the fire is, what trails are open or closed, that kind of thing. So I've included our phone number on this slide, that 907-260-2820 will reach Refuge staff that can help you out with trip planning, so you don't get lost and you know where you can and can't go. And then last but not least in the trip planning aspect is we've got lots of wildlife. It is a wildlife refuge. It is Alaska. We know we have wildlife in our backyards and in our grocery store parking lots. So we need to also keep that in mind when we're planning. This is spring. We have bears out. We have moose that are about to calve. So whenever you venture out on an outdoor adventure, you need to keep that in mind and plan accordingly. Make sure that you're familiar with your bear deterrents. Stay alert, make noise in brushy areas. And it's really tempting to be quiet and just head down, look around, and explore and hunt. This is the time to also be a little more alert to where you are and who else is out with you. So I think at the very end of this, I mentioned dogs before for their safety, but I also want you to just keep in mind that this might not be an entire family trip. Keep in mind who you bring, make sure they're prepared for this kind of adventure. And I think with that, I hope you have a wonderful trip out into the burn area. This information is all online on the Kenai Refuge website, and we'll share those links at the end of this program as well. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Miss Kate for the thing that you've been waiting for.
Morel, thank you, Leah, and thank you, Brenda, for trying to work through these technical challenges. So my name is Kate Mohatt. I'm with the Chugach National Forest. I've been an ecologist for the forest now for about 15 years. I also co-organized the Girdwood Fungus Fair and the Cordova Fungus Festival, and I started the Turning an Arm Ecological Society. And I've been fortunate enough to be successful over the years at finding morels at a variety of forest fire areas across the state. So I'm going to share with you some of what I know and what I don't know, which you might be surprised is a lot. And hopefully that will help you to be successful this spring in finding morels safely and confidently. So as Leah mentioned, the Swan Lake Fire was devastating for a lot of reasons. It burned 167,000 acres. We had a lot of smoke that really put a damper on our summer. Structures were impacted, but this is a normal thing for those who've lived on the Kenai and also interior Alaska. These are what are considered fire-adapted ecosystems. An example of a fire-adapted species is the burn morel. This is a shot from a fire off of Chugach Lake maybe 5 years ago of a carpet of morel mushrooms fruiting in the spring after fire. Assuming you all know what morel mushrooms are, but if you don't, they're a highly prized choice edible mushroom, frequently featured in French cuisine. It's iconic, it's easy to identify if you know what you're doing, and we'll get into the lookalikes here in a minute. And it's often, I find, the gateway mushroom into wild foraged mushrooms. It's one of the first mushrooms that come up in the spring, and it's a choice edible. So I think often people's first wild mushroom forage is for this mushroom. And I'm happy to report that it doesn't end in the spring. I hope this opens your doors, if you're new to mushroom foraging, to continue to learn more about the many species that we have here in Alaska that come up in the fall, especially. So as I mentioned, we know quite a bit about morels, and there's probably even more that we don't know. They're pretty mysterious. For quite a while, it was believed that they were decomposers, that we saw a bunch of morels up after a fire because they're decomposing all of the burned plant material that's now accessible. Now we know that that might not be entirely the case. It turns out that quite a few morels are, they form mutualistic relationships with trees and shrubs. They could sometimes be decomposers, and they can also sometimes form these mutualistic relationships with trees where they get sugars from the tree in exchange for providing the tree with nutrients and water. We know that morels fruit in the spring. That's one thing we know. Mostly, I found them as late as October on the Kenai, but that's anomalous. Common morel habitats really depend on the species. In the West, most of our morels, especially the burn ones, are black morels. They tend to associate with disturbance, burn areas being a prime example of that. And they tend to associate with conifers. Folks from the Midwest or the South, or I know a lot of river fishermen in the West know about yellow morels. They don't require disturbance. They can get quite large. They grow in deciduous forests. You often find them in the spring with cottonwoods along riverbanks. Morels in Alaska, where you will find them most abundantly, are after wildfires. We might have some yellow morels. I've never seen them in deciduous forests, but I've seen credible reports of them. However, if you're looking for the large quantities of morels and the kind of gimme hunt, you're going to go to a recently burned area. This paper was written in 2005 by Trish Wirtz and others that explored, after some pretty major fires in the interior Alaska. They looked at ecology of mushrooms and morels after fire. They also did an analysis of commercial harvesting in Alaska during that time. This paper, we have a link that we'll supply in the comments, is full of great information on different things that they found. I'll cover some of that in this talk, but it's a great reference. And it's free and easy to find on the web if you don't have the link. Okay, a little bit about morel biology. This is the life cycle of morels. It's similar to other mushrooms, but with some pretty key differences. What I think is fascinating is that this life cycle was published in 1990 by Tom Volk and Tom Leonard. That wasn't that long ago. We were learning things pretty recently, really. So we'll start at this morel cycle. I'll mention, let me see if I can get a laser pointer up here. Whoops, sorry about that. Here we go. I'll mention, now I forgot what I was going to say. Sorry about that. We'll start with the mushroom here, the fruiting body. And this is true with all mushrooms. The whole purpose of a mushroom is to produce spores and then get them out into the environment. And morel spores are thin-walled, which leads us to believe that they don't persist in the environment for very long. They likely germinate pretty quickly into a thin, fragile mycelium that spreads into a suitable substrate, like soil. forest floor. And a majority of the organism is this mycelium that's in the substrate. And what it's doing in the substrate, as I mentioned in the ecology slide, is somewhat of a mystery. Is it forming these mutualistic relationships with trees? Is it decomposing dead plant material? We're not entirely sure. But we know in the fall that they form these structures called sclerotium. And this is unique in the mushroom world. Now I remember what I was going to say. The impetus for digging into the Morel life cycle was because people want to know if they can commercially cultivate these mushrooms. Right now, really the best way to get them is to harvest them from the wild. Wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be, you know, a gold mine if you could figure out how to grow these things? So that's where this work came from. And they were successful at getting spores to germinate, and they were successful at getting them to form the sclerotium. This is the tricky part. The sclerotium is a thick-walled structure. It's quite large. You can see it with the naked eye, unlike mycelium. And it's resilient from freezing and wildfires, it turns out. So it's a sturdy structure. It's similar to a tuber in a plant or a potato. And it can go one of two ways. It can germinate in the spring into additional mycelium and start the process again, or it can fruit into a mushroom. And we think that the wildfires provide that, that kick that the sclerotium's looking for, that trigger to get them to produce mushrooms in mass. Now a little bit about Morel taxonomy. It's a tale of 6 morels. So when I was in mushroom school, which was about 20 years ago at the Plant Sciences and Plant Pathology Department in Montana State University, I learned that there's roughly 6 to 8 species of morels in North America. There's several species of black morels that have maybe different shaped caps, or one of them's partially free, one of them's not. And then you have the yellow morel. So easy enough, right? Felt pretty confident at putting names on things when there's just this small list to choose from. Then, and this is a common story in the world of mycology, it turns out there's a tremendous amount of diversity in the mushroom world, and there's not a lot of mycologists. So a fine example of that is morels. There was this huge morel data collection project that occurred in the early 2000s, where hundreds of morels that have been collected across North America. These were pulled from herbariums and collected. Michael Kuo in 2011 published a taxonomic revision of the true morels from collections from Canada and the United States. These added 14 new species, so that more than doubled what we thought we had in North America in just a few years of looking. And not only that, so that was 2011. In the last few years since then, new species are still being described. And like I said, this is a common story in the world of mushrooms. You can see these new species, just looking at them, I would have a hard time telling them apart from any other black morel I've seen, and that's certainly part of the problem why they've been hiding in plain sight this whole time, is because they're very difficult to tell apart morphologically. And the only way they're able to tease out all of these new species is they're looking at DNA, they're sequencing portions of the DNA. They're also pulling it together with spore shape, habitat, plant associations, and other cues that help distinguish them as separate species. So this is a completely made up graph that I tried to reproduce from something I found on social media, but I thought it kind of explained things well, at least in the world of mycology, and I think it applies to other things as well. Essentially, your confidence in putting a name on something as your mushroom knowledge expands. This was me and a lot of other people in the early 2000s when we thought we had 6 species of morels. Our confidence in putting a name on morels was high. Now we know with these new studies out what we don't know. So essentially, the more we learn, the more we realize that we have a lot more to learn. And maybe eventually we'll get back up here again. And this slide I include in all of my mushroom talks and have for 15, 20 years are my 7 rules for when eating wild mushrooms for the first time. Rule number 1 is know exactly what species you have. And it's funny because at the time, I'm sure I was confident in putting a species name to something, and that's what I thought you had to do to confidently eat that. Now we know that we don't know our species as well as we thought we did, but it's still really important to have a good idea of what species group at least you're trying to identify. And just as importantly, you should know what the lookalikes are, if any of them are dangerous. If they are, how do you tell the difference? There's no rule of thumb for what's edible and what's not. And then of course, cook everything. I'm gonna emphasize this again. It's really, really important with morels to cook them. And eat only a small amount at first. Quite a few people are sensitive to morels. And even if you cook them well, it can make some people sick. Also a good idea to keep a good representative specimen in the fridge in case you get sick. That will help others to verify your identification or misidentification. And be picky. Rotten mushrooms can make you sick, even edible rotten mushrooms. And if you're not comfortable with eating mushrooms, don't. And don't pressure anyone else if they are. And it's important to eat mushrooms in moderation anyway, because they aren't very digestible. Okay, so how do I boost your confidence back up to where you can at least identify morels and feel comfortable eating them? So what you're looking for are true morels. And in burn areas, they're generally black or gray, or sometimes light colored. When cut in half, the cap and the stem are all one piece. They're completely hollow in the middle. Okay. And this is the one exception of a morel that I think we can confidently put a name on when you see it. This was described for the first time in 2008. I collected this mushroom in a basket of them on the Kenai and the Quartz Creek area in 2010. So it had been described as a new species for exactly 2 years when we were collecting it. And it's absolutely beautiful, especially when young. The cap is gray, the stem is gray. They're quite dark when they're really young. I'll show you an example of that in the next slide. And if you have a hand lens, this is a cool one to look up really closely. It has really fine hairs. So this is a collection of morels that I got out of a burn area in Fairbanks. It was a small burn area. This is the Morchella tomentosa, the gray morel. What are the other ones? I don't know. I collected them, I dried them, I sent them off to a lab for sequencing. That was a couple years ago. I haven't heard back yet, but I felt confident eating them or giving them to somebody else to eat because I knew they were true morels based on the characteristics I described earlier. Now, second most important thing is know what the lookalikes are and which ones can hurt you. This is a false spring morel, Verpa bohemica. It's out right now. It typically fruits before morels, but they can overlap. It's out along the Seward Highway, and it associates with cottonwoods. So you're not going to see this in a burn area. And it's really easy to tell from a morel because when you cut it in half, there is cobwebby tissue inside versus morels, which are completely hollow. The cap is just attached at the top and it's free, unlike a true morel where the cap and the stem are all one piece. The cap is wrinkled instead of pitted, and it's just a lighter brown than you see in morels. It also seems to get quite a bit bigger. The stalk is quite a bit longer. And this one, a lot of people eat. They'll mistake it for morels, or maybe they know that it's verpas, but they've been eating them for years and they find them delicious. And I think quite a few people can get away with that. With this particular species, however, there's a higher incidence of gastric upset than with morels. And this can occur with people who've eaten this their whole lives or for years. To have it one day make them severely ill. So just be aware of that. And this one is the other really common false morel. I found this one today, not in a burn area, but with alder and cottonwood, but it also occurs in burn areas, and it can occur right next to true morels. This one's pretty dangerous, despite its Latin name, Gyromitra esculenta. Esculenta means edible in Latin, and it is, if properly prepared, keyword properly, and you're welcome to look more into how that's done, but this is not a recommended edible. It is poisoned people in Europe and made people very, very sick in North America, sometimes fatally so. How you tell the difference between this one and a true morel is the cap is much has more of a reddish tint than a brown or a gray. It's brain-like versus pitted or wrinkled like the others. When you cut it in half, it has hollow parts, but it's more like chambers. The flesh is more folded and convoluted. Again, do not recommend this mushroom, and absolutely know what this one looks like, so you're not mixing it in with your morels. And when you see this one growing with morels, I think it's fairly obvious it's something different. Okay, so if this was a live cast, this would be quiz time. How many, since it's Leah and Brenda, I'm gonna pick on you. How many species of mushrooms are in this photo?
I'm guessing 5. Nope, maybe 6. But I'll stick with my original 5.
All right, Brenda, any guesses? No.
It helps to unmute myself.
Yeah.
I'm thinking 6.
Okay, you guys erred on the high side. My guess is between 4 to 5 species. So we have our true morels on this left side. There might be 2 species here that might be the same species. This could be a young version, and this could be an older, more mature specimen. Hard to say. I'll have to ask Noah later for confirmation. This middle mushroom is the Verpa bohemica that we talked about, the early false morel. Some people can eat, some people can't. And then to the right, we have 2 different species of the Gyromitra, the Eskelin that we talked about. And this is a different one that associates with snowbanks. I haven't found it here, but it just might occur here. So good job, you guys.
Well, as a novice, it's very clear to me that the true morel is that hollow from tip to stern. No doubt about it.
Yep. Great. It's that simple. That's morel identification. Okay, so now that we know what we're looking for and what to avoid, where do we find them? Obviously, you've heard this mentioned a bunch. Burn areas are a hot spot. No pun intended. We know about the Swan Lake Fire, and Leah already mentioned where you can get maps of that burn perimeter. There was also other fires around the state and up north that occurred last summer. You can find that information at the Alaska Interagency Coordination Center. There's a web link there. But if you're not in Alaska and looking for burn sites in other states, you can try the NC website for burn history maps to get you started. Now, once you're in the burn area, this is so cool. This is the Forest Service and the Refuge just recently completed, and other partners I shouldn't leave out, existing vegetation map for the entire Kenai Peninsula. This was completed in 2017, so 2 years before the burn. So this is a veg map of different plant dominance types across the Kenai Peninsula. This is going to be really interesting for helping us target key habitats for morels. And this map is widely available on the interwebs. It's easiest to just search Kenai vegetation story map, and that should come right up. You can download the veg map if you have ArcGIS, or you can just view it online. And I'm going to talk more about this. So this is a zoomed up version in the Chugach Lake area. As you can see, it's pretty fine resolution. So it shows really well the different plant community dominance types. And so here's my theory as to what habitats we should be targeting for morels. I think definitely conifers. Alder is not going to be fruitful. That's my theory. I would avoid sedge peatlands for sure. I would target the conifer, possibly conifer broadleaf mixes, like black spruce, broadleaf, or white Lutz spruce. And the mountain hemlock, Sitka spruce, you're not going to find that on the refuge side of the burn. And I say I have a theory, it's because I don't know for sure. We don't have very great data on where morels would associate, what specific plant community types. So now that we have this fresh veg map and this burn, this is a pretty fantastic opportunity to answer some of those questions. So I just had this idea over the weekend, and I thought the easiest way to roll it out would be via an iNaturalist project. iNaturalist, if you've never used it before, is really cool. It can be used for a variety of taxa. You can use it for insects, plants, birds, animals, anything. So I created an iNaturalist project that's specific to the Swan Lake Fire burn morels. If you don't want to do that, another way to do that would be to, take GPS coordinates and maybe send that data to me. Yes, I'm asking for your morel spots. That doesn't generally go over very well with morel hunters. I certainly wouldn't do that. But morels are different. They don't really come up in the same place year after year. It's more of a giant event that they come out, and once you get your morels, it's generally the first year is the best. It's kind of done. So here's my pitch. If you go out and you find some good morel patches, take some photos with your smartphone if you have the location enabled, and then wait a couple months until the morel season's done, and then upload them to iNaturalist. So nobody can find, and nobody knows your spot, and they can't go there, it's already done. And then we'll end up with this great data that will help future morel hunters such as ourselves really target which habitat types would be good. And it's going to be super interesting for science too. And Leah at the end is going to provide some prizes for some people that sign up for this thing. Okay, so what does on the ground good morel habitat look like? This is a photo I took on the Chugach Lake burn a few years back where we had some pretty good success. This is clearly a pretty moderately to severely burned conifer forest. Notice the green patch in the middle indicates, this was a liverwort, indicates some moisture there. So that can be a helpful microsite. I found it, morels in this area. I've also found lots of this area without morels. Let me back up 1 second and say that if you are in the burn and you're not finding morels, that's also a worthwhile observation. There's going to be a lot of areas that don't have them. That'll tell us, you know, maybe that plant community type isn't as good. Okay, here's another shot of a great hunting spot that we found up north of Fairbanks area. Notice a lot of that duff layer has been burned off. This would be a mixed conifer broadleaf forest, and we found a lot of morels, but they were really patchy. The first, I want to say, a half hour, 45 minutes, we didn't find anything, and then we really got into them. And that's my trusty morel canine there. When I hunt morels, I typically put them in paper bags or mesh bags. And the reason folks use mesh bags is because morels can spread their spores, continue to spread their spores after they're collected from those bags. And in my backpack, I also have extra water. It gets really hot in burn areas. I've got my GPS, and I've got a knife that I'm using to collect mushrooms. So this is an on-the-ground shot of the Chugach Lake area. And from the Trish Wirtz paper of harvesting morels after wildfire in Alaska, they found that they were finding more morels in moderately to severely burned areas and towards the base of trees. So that's a key little microsite you want to zero in on. They found morels fruiting with white spruce, black spruce, paper birch, and a variety of site types. Another thing to keep in mind when you're looking at your veg map for possible sites. Another paper produced in 2010 found a high density of morels requires the removal of the duff layer and, again, severe damage to nearby trees. That makes sense when you think about that sclerotium from the life cycle. It's right there at the mineral soil layer, and if that duff doesn't burn off all the way, it's possible the morels just can't push through that layer. And then a few more thoughts with regards to microsites, Wirtz and others. There's been books written about this, how frustrating and tricky it is to find these morels. Where you find them in gross abundance or not is difficult to predict. But the one thing we know we need for a strong morel fruiting is precipitation. Without rain, the mushrooms will dry up or they might never fruit at all. And while it doesn't look like there's much in the immediate forecast, the NOAA projection for May does say above normal chances for precipitation and above normal chances for higher temperature. So that's good news for morel hunters. Okay, once you've got your haul, it's really important to either put them in the refrigerator right away or get them on the dehydrator right away. You do not want to store morels or collect morels in plastic bags. They'll rot much faster. If you leave them in a car, in a bag or a basket, and it's a warm car, for just a few hours, they'll start to deteriorate pretty quickly. So you'll want to take care of them as soon as you can. I prefer to just dry them all versus eating them fresh. And the reason is you're harvesting morels in a burn area. They're really dirty. They're full of soot. Quite a few of them have insects in them. So when you're putting them on the dehydrator, a lot of that dirt falls off, the insects come out, and you want to dehydrate them enough to where they're potato chip crispy before you store them, or else they will, just a little bit of moisture can rot the bag. When it comes to eating morels, I've alluded to this a few times, some people have problems with them. Yes, all true morels are considered edible for most. Quite a few people have had bad reactions to morels, and almost everyone, if eaten a raw morel, will be sick. So you always want to cook your morels. You cannot overcook them. I personally am sensitive to morels, but I find that if I cook them for ridiculous amounts of time, I'm talking 45 minutes, then I'm okay with it. And so I mentioned this earlier as well, when trying morels for the first time, only try a little bit and give it that 12 to 24 hours to make sure you're not sensitive. And if you do have an adverse reaction to morels, expect to have it again, or possibly worse. Or like I said, try cooking them even more next time if you're brave. It probably won't end well. But at worst, you're talking gastric upset.
So when you're saying cooking them, they're more like a stewed, you're just slow simmering them for that amount of time? Okay.
So what I do, and I'm super cautious, is I'll take dried morels, rehydrate them in boiling water, dump that water. I'll boil them for even like 5 minutes. You're getting all that dirt off when you're doing that. You're agitating them, getting that dirt off and cleaning them. Then I'll cut them and saute them in a skillet with butter, continuing to add water if needed to keep them moist for up to 45 minutes in a saute. I've quickly put them in things and cooked them for what I thought was enough time, maybe 15-20 minutes, and that was not enough, at least for me. Probably plenty for most people. And then finally, I just wanted to show you a new publication that we just put together last week. It's just a quick reference guide to Alaskan burn morels. This has all the identification information that I went over in this presentation, including the same photos. It's available online. You can just print it out, put it in your pocket. The other thing I mentioned earlier was hopefully morels might encourage you to expand your mushroom horizon. If so, there's a free brochure on mushrooms of the National Forest of Alaska. It's got 51 species that are common in the Kenai Peninsula area. That's available online for free, or once our office is open again, you can pick them up at a Forest Service office. And back to Leah, that's all I've got.
Thanks so much, Kate. I learned a ton. I'm sure others will have lots of questions. The first that people will wonder about after seeing that really big burn scar is where can I go? How can I just go find all those morels, and what can I do with them afterwards? Like I said at the very beginning of this presentation, the Swan Lake Fire burned the vast majority on Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, which is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service land. On the refuge, you can go anywhere in that burn area, except for a couple trails that are closed to the public for restoration. But everywhere in that burn area, you can go, you can harvest as much morels as you can find, but you cannot sell it. No sale to your friends, no sale on social media, no commercial harvest to send out to your buddy for just a small little payment or whatever. They're just for personal use. So that's one of the kind of caveats, but just it's for a recreational, enjoyable, like how we started at the beginning. This is a great way of getting out with your friends and family, staying socially distanced, but really having a great time out in this beautiful Alaska we call home. Over on the Chugach National Forest, there are some structures in place to provide permits for commercial harvest of mushrooms. That landscape is a lot different than what Kate just described as like the primo spot to look for morels. But you'll need to contact the Chugach National Forest at these phone numbers or website to look into commercial permits. A permit is required in any case over on the forest land, but on Refuge, which is where we're hoping we'll find our morels after that first rainfall, those are all going to be for personal use, and you can have fun putting them up and just enjoying them throughout the whole year. I think that covers it. Kate, do you have anything else to add on that component?
I don't.
Okay.
No, yep, that's great.
Perfection.
I do have a question, Miss Leah, just so that I understand correctly. There is no permit required on the refuge side. It's personal use. You've explained that very well. But on the Chugach National Forest, the commercial harvest permit is required for those who are going to do personal or commercial. Do you?
Thanks for that question. No, personal use harvest on the entire burn area is open without any permitting. It's already provided for in both the Forest Service and the refuge lands. So for you and your friends to go out, harvest mushrooms, put them in your dehydrator or in your freezer, that's totally fine on both Forest Service and refuge. The only place that commercial might be possible is on the forest land.
Thank you for that clarification. If both of you don't mind, I can go to some comments, questions here in the comment thread from Facebook on KPB Alerts. I know that this video will also be cross-posted onto the Refuge page as well as uploaded onto YouTube. And
perfect. And it's up to you if you want to see our faces. We're happy to do that, or we can keep this up. I think
why don't we go ahead and drop the slideshow for now. We can always reiterate that later with the links. And then if you guys don't mind, I can ask you guys questions that I'm seeing.
That's perfect. Okay. And I have a couple that I grabbed from our comments on the Refuge page as well. So let's just go back and forth. Go ahead, Brenda, you start.
So one of the questions is, will there be marked access on the lands as far as where folks can enter or not? And with that, are there going to be areas within those access points that provide suggested morel picking areas?
All right, so Kate, it's 160,000 acres, but just get out there and with a magic wand, wouldn't that be amazing? Actually, no, that would be, I just want that. I want that service. To start off, the entire burn area is accessible, but the overlying rules of operation on a highway exist. So that hard shoulder of the Sterling Highway exists for emergency stopping, not for pausing for a couple hours to go look for morels. So using really, really good judgment. Remember, we're moving into the spring and summer. We're going to have school out in just a little bit. There will be a lot more activity on the highway. So using proper pullouts, making sure you're respectful of where you park in those pullouts to allow for motor vehicles that are under speed to get off the highway if they need to safely. Those are aspects that I ask just anyone, whether you're morel picking or not, to keep in mind. All of the trail access points are open with the exception of just a few, very well marked closed trails. And then along the Eskelin Lake Road, which might be another popular access point, we can accommodate some temporary pull-offs, but if you'll stay on durable surface, there are a lot of trailhead parking lots of kind of side roads where you can move out of the movement of traffic, but don't find yourself in a wet zone. There is a lot of changed hydrology. So where we may have been able to pull off on the side, like into the ditch along that road, I really don't recommend that. going out there this last weekend, there's a lot of standing water and you won't necessarily see the mud. So staying on durable surface to protect the landscape and also your vehicle. But no marks and no closed areas per se.
With that, will there be additional access points provided?
Oh, I'll cover what might come up in a side question regarding access points, because I know Mystery Creek Road is very attractive when you're looking at that map as a place that kind of gives you a pretty easy access into the burn. During that whole road, Mystery Creek Road, experienced during breakup some really intense changes to the roadbed. It had a lot of erosion and fallen trees. So that road will not be open specially for mushroom hunting. It traditionally opens the first full week in August, and that's our goal. But the road in some places has been completely washed out. So that's a side project unrelated to mushroom hunting. But that gate will remain closed. You can still park in a pull-out on the highway and walk towards the gate and use that for foot traffic. But we won't be opening any particular areas up just for the express use for mushroom hunting.
Good to know, good to know. One of the other questions, and this would be for Miss Kate, can mushrooms be picked where there was fire retardant dropped?
Oof, that is an excellent question. And that is one that I've thought about and I never followed up. I don't have the answer to that. You might want to try Google. I'm sorry.
Well, you know what we'll do is we'll provide, we'll research it and we can provide it in the comment thread.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the good news
I'm gonna have to look into that.
A lot of water was dropped on Swan Lake Fire, but not a lot of retardant. The retardant was very isolated to protect the communities, especially of Sterling. A little bit in the Skelach area. Remember, fire retardant is colored for a very important reason, so that you can see where it was dropped. It does not hide. It's still very apparent out in the Skelach area where it was dropped around just to protect a couple of facilities out there. And they're still pink. So it doesn't hide. And that might be a good hint that if you're seeing pink splattered trees, that would kind of give you a little bit of a clue that you're in an area that may have been affected by fire retardant. But on Swan Lake Fire, because of the way it was burning, the locations and the attempt and the hard work of our firefighters to protect our communities first and foremost, the efforts were really isolated to those edges, and water was used elsewhere. So that might help.
Thank you for that. Another question is, are there any resource maps that indicate private versus public lands for access?
Swan Lake Fire is entirely on federal land. So you cannot find a piece of Swan Lake Fire that is going to be on private land. In this case, it's a unique situation. It never moved off of the federal landscape.
Thank you for that. I'll let you read some questions you may have, Miss Leah.
I have a couple, and this is for Kate. Is there a way to ensure regrowth of morels? The concern is that if you harvest them a certain way, you may be risking not having them come back, if that's an issue at all. So is there, between cutting or digging them up or not harvesting all that you find in an area and hoping no one else does, is there a way to ensure some regrowth there?
There's no way to ensure it. Like I mentioned, precipitation is really the big thing. And there's not really good data to confirm that, over-harvesting is a concern for burn morels in particular, or that picking them up out of the soil versus cutting them at the base does much harm. Either way is fine. I like the idea of the mesh bags to promote spore dispersal, and generally with any sort of wild harvesting, the general rule is that you don't take all of them. But when it comes to morels, you'll want to leave some anyway if they're too old or too young. It's never a good idea to take them all, but no, I wouldn't have too many sustainability concerns beyond that. And only come up for upwards of 3 years post-fire anyway in a given area.
That kind of flows into another question that I have here, which is how long can we expect after we get that first kind of bout of precipitation and we end up with morel growth? How long is a typical morel season in that first or second year after fire, within that year?
Sure, so within the first year, it's gonna be 100% precipitation dependent. What typically happens on the Kenai is May and June is really dry. So I think that morel season typically gets cut short because of a lack of precipitation. And then, and a lot of studies have shown this, that really the biggest flush of morels is going to be that first year after fire, but they'll continue to come up, again, given the right conditions, precipitation being the big one, several years beyond. You just won't find them in such huge abundance.
I have one more, Brenda. Do you have any others?
I'm not seeing any additional.
Okay, the last one that I have is, and you covered it to most of the degree, but the question was, is there a best species? So you mentioned the likelihood species, but is there a best? So if you were only going out and targeting a single tree, where would you find burn morels by, of all those three I think you mentioned?
Of the best of the morel species?
The best of the trees to look for.
Oh, the best of the trees. That's the thing, I don't know. There's not great data to say one way or the other. My suspicion is black spruce or white spruce. And if I was going to target black spruce, I'd probably avoid peatlands unless they were burned down to the soil mineral layer, which is pretty deep.
That is
but
helpful.
I've had terrific luck in hemlock. I think just conifers in general. But then Wirtz's paper said they found quite a few in birch forests, which be worth exploring.
So,
we have a lot.
A convenient segue into how to learn more information about where to find morels after a fire. Do you want to explain to our viewers how, and this is going to be limited to the first 20 people to do this activity. I highly recommend anyone who's interested in learning more about identification of really cool natural things out in the world. iNaturalist is a remarkable resource. You don't have to know anything more than it's a spider, and you post a picture, and then experts in the field and also generally local experts will almost identify it before you're out of the, done with your hike. So iNaturalist is awesome anyway, but it has this component of project, and that can kind of focus some efforts. So do you want to talk through it, and I'll share what our first 20 participants will get?
Sure. So I alluded to how do we use citizen science. We know a lot of people are going to be out in the burn area collecting mushrooms, and how do we garner that information to help us better understand where morels grow for future. And because we have that amazing veg map, we can overlay where people are finding morels, and just as importantly, not finding morels with those plant community types. And probably the easiest way to do it is, as you mentioned, the iNaturalist platform. You can download the app on your smartphone. And any picture you take, you can, if you have location enabled on your phone, you won't have to input location, date, or any of that information. It just pulls that from the information collected by your phone. And it will post these online observations of where you're at, what you're seeing. And like Leah said, there's a lot of naturalists standing by that love to identify things on this iNaturalist. So it's great for contributing information in a field that we don't have that much information, the morels and what habitats you could find them. Also, if you're not sure about your morel identification, if you have questions, yeah, post it on iNaturalist. You're going to get an answer pretty fast. And Leah said, so we have a project page, the Chugach morels. I think we're going to post a link to that. Chugach burn morel, or not, sorry, Swan Lake burn morels. And you can join the project as a member. You sign up for iNaturalist, and then you can join the project. And the first 20 people who join get.
Drum roll.
Oh my goodness! It's a mesh morel hunter bag, specifically for the.
Even has a zipper for that, you know, GPS or hunting knife or whatever you got. So.
That's awesome.
So the way they're going to be able to do that is if you sign up for iNaturalist, or if you're already in there, that's perfect. Once you join the Swan Lake Fire Morel project, you're going to screenshot that. You can get creative. We can work with you if you know, technology is a third or fourth language for you. We'll work through it. But the goal is that you participate in that project. We're doing a little bit of a faith thing. If you've signed up for the project, and like Kate said, you really don't want to share all your finds in the heat of the season, that is okay. If you document and keep that private to your own information until, you know, after all the morels are gone and even snow's flying, but you do kind of follow through and get that information to her, through that project or through an email. That's what we want to encourage, but also thank you in advance for helping the next generation of morel hunters know a little bit more about where to go and not rely so much on guesses. So if you're interested in participating in any of that, you screenshot your participation in that project and you're going to email it to me. I'm going to put my email address in the comments so that you can read it. You can call that number, that 907-260-2820 number that goes to the visitor center at the Refuge, and I'll be available there. But my email address is my name, which conveniently is on the screen. So Leah_Eskelin@fws.gov. So the first 20 people who sign up for the project and screenshot that participation to me, I will mail you out one of these really cool, brand new, hot off the presses. And a huge thank you to the Friends of Alaska National Wildlife Refuges who sponsor these morel hunting bags for you. They will come complete with all of the safety information, fire map, and they have a lot of information already printed on them. So I think that covers it.
This is an outstanding presentation. Me, who does not pick mushrooms, learned a lot. My father was a morel mushroom picker, and I would total around with him, but never would pick them. So,
are we going to find you out there in the burn now?
You may just do that, if anything, for the fresh air. So, ladies, thank you so much for your time. Closing comments, Miss Kate.
Well, stay safe out there. I hope you all find a lot of morels and have a good time doing it, and cook them very, very well.
Thank you for that. Miss Leah.
You know, I can't top that. Yeah, your safety is our priority. Ask if you need any help. We would love to connect you to the right person. If you need mapping, or if you need help to run your GPS, or just need, you know, recipes for morels, would love to help you at the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. So reach out. We're available even before the visitor center reopens.
Very good. Thank you so much for your time tonight, and we will end this video and get it uploaded as soon as we can.
Thanks so much, Brenda.
Bye-bye.